Gloria Bristo Brown. She knew her great-grandmother, who had been a slave, and witnessed her daughter become a lawyer and have a 3 strikes case decided by the United States Supreme Court. All of her children graduated college with advanced degrees and are successful. She saw the first black president, and she has migrated from the South, Louisiana, to the North, California, experienced different racism from both sides. And lastly, because her husband was one of the first black Air Force officers, she witnessed the integration of the armed forces and raised her children during this time. Now, hello, I want you to start and let the people know your name.
I was born in Hammond, Louisiana in 1932, Gloria Joy Crook. I married Albert Bristow and later on Les Brown. I had 4 children, Sherry, Joy, Ben, and Gail. I have 2 grandchildren, Kareem and Kimbra, and 2 great-grandchildren, Yusef and Sonia. I am glad to be able to pass this down to them and hope that they enjoy it as much as I have enjoyed it. I'll start with one of my earliest memories. When I was 3.5 years old, I was hit by a truck and both my legs were broken. It was in the South, and the nearest hospital was about 50 miles away. So I can remember being in the ambulance, and my mother was there telling me stories to try to survive herself. But she was crying, so I patted her and told her not to worry, because they're gonna huff and puff until they blow the house down. I was in the hospital for 6 weeks. Both my legs were in support systems, and one of them kept falling. And years later, when I was starting college and they did a physical, one of the things they did was a x-ray, and they informed me that one of my legs was shorter than the other one, and I realized it had to be because of that, the falling back and forth. After 6 weeks in the hospital, when they were getting ready to release me, they realized that I had also suffered injuries to my head, and they ended up shaving off all of my hair except one braid and stitching up my scalp. So I can only think that a hospital where that my leg fell so many times, and such a thing as a serious injury to the scalp hadn't even been detected for 6 weeks. They were incompetent, and I was fortunate to have survived that whole episode of my life. And years later, when I got back and to the house and everything, my father's friend looked at me and he shook his head and he said, "She used to be such a pretty girl."
Wow.
And actually, I ended up with scars on my face, and I was conscious of them over the years. And eventually, when I was in college, the Alphas were having their national convention, and the sororities in the Bay Area were nominating contestants to be the queen of the ball. And the Deltas nominated me, and much to my surprise, I ended up being the queen of the ball. And so after an evening of being on stage and dancing and what have you, we were coming back to Oakland, and I hadn't been to the bathroom the whole time. And so Al found a bus station that had a 24-hour outhouse available. So he pulled up and parked, and I hopped out of the car and ran in. And when I got inside, it turned out that you needed to be able to pay a toll to get into the restroom. And at that time, there was no way I could have made it back out to the car where I left my purse, come back in again, and I couldn't crawl under the door. So what I ended up doing was hopping up on the face, the face stool, and I felt like if someone walked in, they would look at me and see a young black woman in a formal gown with a crown on her head and a big bouquet of flowers in her arm, and they would think they were hallucinating. So I wasn't afraid. I just sat there with a big smile on my face and took care of business.
Okay.
Yes, and so that was quite the adventure for me. And I realized in looking back over at all this that I've known 7 generations of my family, and that includes both of my great grandmothers who had been slaves, and Grandma Peoples. When I would be visiting, she would.
Now, who's Grandma Peoples?
That was my mother's grandmother. So it was my great grandmother. So she was telling me about when she had been a young child as a slave, and she was sent out to the storage house to get some flour, because the kitchen was separated from the actual houses there because of the fire possibilities. So she went and got the flour, and on the way back she fell, and the flour, of course, flew all over the sand and the dirt and what have you. So what her mistress did was that they had to make up some muffins, and she had to eat these dirt muffins. And like I said, I was only a little over 4 years old, so I didn't understand about freedom and what have you, but I did understand enough to know that I was grateful that I didn't have to eat dirt muffins. When I was in kindergarten, the teacher decided that she was going to punish the class because they had dropped paper on the floor. And I explained to her that I not only had not dropped the paper on the floor, that was not the kind of thing that I would do. So she whopped off and hit me first. So I hit her back and took off running and hid behind the exit door. And she and the class came running out. And as they went to the right to look for me at the playground, I went to the left to walk home, and walked on home. And you think about a 5-year-old walking down a railroad track, and even crossing over trestles over water, where if a train had come, I would have no idea what to do. But I made it home, and that night when my father came home, the first thing I said was, "Daddy, you always told me if somebody hit me to hit them back." And he said, "It's hit me today." So I hit her back. And I never heard anything else about it. And I can only come to the conclusion that he contacted me. This was in the South. And of course, he knew all the school staff and everything. He must have contacted her and explained that it was really his responsibility for telling me that. I'd only been following his instructions, because I went back to school the next day and I never heard anything else about it, anything like that. And then in the first grade, the school was all the way, it was only one school for blacks in the whole city for grades 1 through 12, and it was all the way on the other side of town. And
I'm sorry, well, just briefly, what year were you born?
What?
What year were you born?
What year was I born?
Yes.
I was born in 1932.
Where were you born?
Hammond, Louisiana.
Okay, so this is during segregation.
Oh yes, it was the Deep South, and so I'd have to walk all the way across town to go to school, and we would be, different children walking across to go to school, and then the buses would be passing with the white kids going to school, and they'd be literally hanging out the window yelling "nigger, nigger, nigger," and we'd be walking along the street looking back up yelling "cracker, cracker, cracker." So that was my experience with the South. When the war came, my father...
Now, before we talk about the war, let's just, your father. Now, your father, well, let's talk about your parents.
Okay.
Okay, your mother was, who was your mom? Mother's name? I'm sorry.
What was my mother's name?
Yes.
Oh, my mother's name was Hazel, and my father's name was Millard.
Okay.
And actually, years later, my grandmother on my mother's side told me that my father's father was Mr. Campbell. He was the owner of the local Hammond Vindicator, the newspaper, and that's where my father worked, and he did everything, including stories, and then you had to set type in order to print the paper and what have you. So he did that, and he actually worked in all levels there. And years later, my grandmother told me that he was actually my grandfather. That was my father's father, because my father could have passed for white, but he chose to be black, and so that it turned out that was who had been his father, which meant to me that I don't know, I had no way of really finding out what was true or not, but in adding things up, I realized my father was 20 years old when I was born. It turned out that my grandmother was 34 years old, his mother. So that means to me that whoever the father was a child abuser.
Because that would mean that his mother, what's her name?
Mama Sue.
Yeah, so Mama Sue had Papa Miller, your father, at 13 or 14.
Yes, that's why I figured that he was a child abuse. But anyhow.
And the father, if I understand, was allegedly Mr. Campbell. And so when he's doing all this work with your father, he's actually...
my father worked there.
His son. He's like working with his son.
I don't know that he was called working with his son, but in any case, he was known as in the city, small town, as Campbell's nigger. So, and years later, after we moved to California and after the war was over and there were no longer all of the military construction sites and what have you, my father was without a job. So he actually found a job working at a newspaper in San Francisco, and Mr. Campbell provided the work history verification for him and everything. But when Daddy went to join the union and put on there that he was black, he couldn't get in this is in California after the war, he couldn't get in the union because he was black. So he was not able to work in a newspaper, although that's where his experience was. So he ended up taking different tests and ended up becoming a janitor. And as a janitor, eventually he was the head janitor for the city of Oakland, and like the Oakland Auditorium, he was there, and there were great appearances there. Count Basie, what have you, Ella Fitzgerald, you name it, they were there. So when they would be appearing, I would be working and Dad would have me working at the hat check stand. And then when the actual performance started, I would go out and stand in the back and look at the performance. And then when it ended, I'd run back and start trying to hook people up with their hats and their coats. But it was interesting. And then later on, when my children moved back into the area and what have you, he'd actually, he was also in charge of the Oakland Coliseum. So when they had the baseball games at Oakland A's, he called me and let me know that I could send my kids because this friend of mine, her kids liked, they liked the baseball too. So I'd call her and she'd take the 4 kids up there and they'd get to go in and see the different games and what have you because Daddy was in charge there and let them in. So that was part of their growing up.
1913. What were the bathrooms like back then? Were they like they are now?
Oh, bathrooms were actually outhouses that were little buildings out behind the house itself. And it was actually just a little shack with a piece of wood with a hole cut in it where you sat down. And then they usually had old newspapers and old magazines and like your Sears catalog and what have you. That was what you used for paper. So I was in the little outhouse and I saw a snake. And I hopped up and I started running and I fell and I hopped up and ran some more and I fell again. And finally when I was going up the back steps to get in the house, I realized that I forgot to pull up my panties because I was so frightened when I saw the snake. Wow. And those houses were such that there was wood stove in the kitchen, and they when it was time on the weekends, the family would bathe, and we'd have a tub in there, and they'd fill it half full of water from the stove, and they'd bathe in that, and then they'd empty that and do the next person and what have you. And there was always some coffee, a big coffee pot on the back of our stove, and so I remember asking my father, my grandmother, if I could have some coffee, and they laughed at me and said no, I couldn't have coffee because coffee make you black. Well, I looked up at them and said, well, if coffee makes you black, why are both of you white? So I was at a day and age where children were, quote, seen and not heard, but I was both seen and heard, and I would ask anybody anything I wanted to.
I have a question about
sure.
Since you bring up your father, Papa Miller. Was there any crazy experiences? Because he looked like a white man, but he's holding your hand. You're a black woman. Was there any?
Well, people would look at us so strange until we came up with this thing where when we would be walking along, he'd be holding my hand, and we'd see somebody and they'd be reacting. We'd start going, so it really may give them something to think about.
You bring up Mr. Campbell and Mama Sue, your grandmother. Was there ever a time where, you said he was, Mr. Campbell's maid was Mama Sue. Was there ever a time where they had you over, like for dinner or something, and she was your waitress? Or she was...
No, because she, like I said, she left before I was born, and the way that I figured out that he was probably a child abuser was that she was 34 years old when I was born, and my father was 20, so that meant that she was only 14 when he was born. So that made whoever was the father of my father was a child abuser. So it was one of those things that was never really addressed. But years later, when I was 15 years old, I actually went back down south to visit my relatives that we've been living in California those years, and for some reason the Campbells invited me to lunch, and so it ended up that here was this 15-year-old and at lunch with these editors of the local newspaper and what have you, and it was my grandmother, quote unquote, who was doing the serving.
And so that would be grandma. Which grandmother was doing the serving?
It was the woman that had raised him. She wasn't actually his mother, but she had raised him. So I'd always known her as my grandmother until later on when I found out my grandmother was actually Mama Sue, and that she had my father when she was 14 years old.
You said that your father came to California when you were 10 years old in World War II. What was your experience in California schools?
Well, when I got to California schools, they just assumed because I was young and black and coming from the South that I was in the 6th grade, and they put me back into the 5th grade because they assumed that I could not actually be qualified and what have you. And one of the things that they had at this school was if they had books, and I just loved to read. And when I was in the South, of course, I had no access to libraries. So what I did most of my
Why is that? Why did you have no access to libraries in the South?
Because they didn't allow the blacks to go into public libraries. And so I wasn't. So what we had in terms of books in the house was encyclopedias. So that's what I had been reading. And then when we moved to California, and I could walk to the local library and check out 5 books, I was just so excited, and I would have. And my parents would come and kiss me goodnight and go to bed and what have you. And as soon as they left, I'd crawl under the cover, and I had a flashlight under there and a book, and I'd be reading the books at night for about an hour. And at the school, they had this program where you got points for reading books. And the children who read the books, most books were given a Jack London book as their reward and what have you. So I read so many books that they didn't believe I was reading the books. So what they did was require that we write a synopsis. So of course I was able to write the synopsis because indeed I had read the books. And so I continued to be the big reader. And then when they had this statewide exam in the 6th grade, it ended up that I came out number 1 in the school, and they thought it was incorrect, so they made them test it again, and I still came out number 1. So it was definitely a different world.
It was the same world, but it was different because it seems as if in California they were questioning your skills and intelligence as well.
Right, because I was from the South and what have you. So, and what actually happened was I ended up most of the time, even in class, I have a book in my lap because I could be a straight A student and still read my book.
So I want to talk about after high school. After high school, what school did you go to?
Oh, after I graduated from high school, I went to San Francisco State, and I ended up 2 years after I put 2 years in, and that's when I got married.
Before you got married, though, I want to go back to you talked about being an alpha.
Being what?
So at San Francisco, you were in a sorority at San Francisco State? Were you in a sorority?
Oh, well, I was a Delta, and yes, that was when I ended up being the sweetheart when the Alphas had their convention and went through that whole process.
And how did that come about? You becoming a Delta?
The Deltas nominated me, and they had these interviews and what have you, and they chose me. So.
And now I understand. I was told by somebody that you also knew a lot of people. There were a lot of unique black people who did a lot of firsts in your circle at this time when you were in college. I was told you knew Bill Russell.
Oh, Bill Russell. Yes, he went to University of San Francisco, and I went to San Francisco State. But the different colleges didn't matter. Most of the black people congregated with their sororities and fraternities. Yeah, so Bill Russell and just a number of different.
Anybody want to name?
Ollie Matson.
Okay, and who was Ollie Matson?
Huh?
Who was Allie Mason?
Matson.
Yeah, who was he?
He was a football player at the same time that Bill Russell was, but Bill Russell ended up getting injured, and so he ended up being the first national black referee. Okay. So it was a different day and age.
And then you said you started talking about your marriage. Who was your first husband?
Al Bristo.
Where'd you meet?
Where did I meet him? At the local church that I attended, and the reason that I left college after 2 years was we were married, and he was sent to Alaska, and so that's when I moved to Alaska, and that's where my first child was born. It was in Alaska.
Okay, and who was your first child?
Sherry.
Wait, now your first husband, Al Bristo. Now, he was one of the first officers in the Air Force during integration? Is that
right? The military had only been integrated for a couple of years when he went into the Air Force, and he went to training and ended up coming out as an officer. And he was one of the first radar observers. It was a new technique and what have you. So he was one of the first ones, and using computers, and it was a new world for those things at that time. And so he did that, and as such, we ended up, we were stationed so many different places all over America, but we also went to Germany, and we lived in Germany and what have you, and it was very, very interesting. Before we went, I took a class in German so we'd be prepared, and I would, after I'd come home from the class, I'd have my kids hopping up and down the bed repeating what I had learned that day and what have you. Then we went to Germany, and nobody understood what we were saying. And it was just like I thought I had done the right thing, but I hadn't. So we were living in a village, and there was one other black family in the village, a military family too. And one day my kids were up the street playing, and I looked out, and there was one of my daughters running down the street, and then the other one was coming along behind her, dragging Ben. And it was just like he couldn't breathe. And so I grabbed him and ran up the hill to the local doctor's office and went in, and he explained to me that he was going to give him a shot, and that if he didn't start breathing, that it would be fatal. There was nothing that could be done and what have you. That he was having an asthmatic attack. And so he gave him the shot, and I was there, breathe, baby, breathe, breathe, baby, breathe. And finally he started breathing. And so the doctor started telling me what to tell him when I took him to the hospital, the local military hospital. So I asked him to write it down in Latin so that the people at the base would understand what he was saying. And it wasn't until later on, after Ben had been hospitalized and everything, that I realized that I had been talking to the doctor in German, and that the thing was not that I didn't take German and what have you. What happened was that I was speaking standard German, and when you got out to the villages, the people from one village to the next could tell which village you were from by common words, because there was that much difference in their terminology and their speaking. And the people in the village where I lived, they had a group come to me to let me know that they didn't want my children to play with this young lady named Petra, and that if they continued to play with Petra, that their children would not be allowed to play with my children. And I didn't know what in the world was going on. Well, it turned out that I was in a Catholic village and Petra was a Protestant. So I was like, I had enough prejudice in my own country. I wasn't going to be in somebody else's country doing that. But they were, when they had seen the pictures of my my grandmother and my father, they asked me, why was I so black? They just didn't, it was a different world. And actually from the back window, looking out of the window, I could look upside the hill and there'd be farmers up there. And that actually, and this was after the war and everything, there'd actually be, the women would be pulling the plow and the men would be guiding it. I found that downright shocking.
How was your experience? You're talking about your experience abroad when you were in the military. How was your experience in the United States with Powell being one of the first persons to integrate the military? What were the racial? Did you experience racism at all, or what was your experience with an Air Force officer?
Well, I can.
And with your kids.
Speaking of race, I can remember one experience when we moved to Duluth, Minnesota, we were stationed in Washington, D.C. at the time. We moved to Duluth, Minnesota. And Al had a problem, of course, finding housing there. We had, everywhere we went, of course, it was more difficult for us to find houses. When I would call and give the information and everything and what the earnings were, and I was always given an appointment. And when I showed up for the appointment and they saw me, it was just like their heads would automatically start shaking because the prejudice was such that in the military you just couldn't go from one base to another and get housing. It was very difficult. So we did a lot of moving around and the whole thing, and Joy ended up being born in Washington, D.C. because we were staying with a family that we had known in Alaska, and when we would station in Newcastle, we talked to them about how Newcastle was, and this fellow officer, his mother-in-law had gone to Newcastle, and so she checked, and the housing was very available and the whole thing. Well, all that time I thought Newcastle was original colony kind of thing. It turned out Newcastle was a southern state, and we couldn't find anywhere to stay there, and so we were there trying to find somewhere to stay, and I went into labor and had to go to the military hospital there, and so that's where she was born. But it was definitely a different world, and I learned more than I ever wanted to learn about discrimination and things of that nature. Sherry was born in 1954. Joy was born in 1956. Bill was born in 1958. And Gail was born in 1960. So they were 2 years apart.
Okay. Did you eventually settle in California when you were
Right after when we left the military, we came to California and settled here. Yes.
Now, how was your children's experience in California? Now, around what time is this?
Well, I was constantly going head to head with the different schools and what have you. And one of the things that happened was that one of my coworkers was getting her master's degrees in education, and she needed to give some IQ tests, and so she got Ben and Gail and another person from where we worked, and she tested the kids. And after she tested them, she asked me if Ben was in the gifted program. I didn't even know what the gifted program was, and it turned out that if you tested at a certain level, they had special programs at the schools, and they had additional funds for them. So it turned out that Ben should have been in the gifted program. And when I went to the school to ask them,
what grade is this? I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
What grade is this?
What grade was
he in at this time when he took this test with your friend?
I think he's in the 5th grade.
Okay.
And when I went to ask about it, they wanted to act like there was something wrong with me for asking about it, and so I whipped out the information that I gotten from my friend as to what the requirements were, and let them know that they were messing with somebody who knew what they were doing. So I told them that I had to, had the state requirements, and that I would contact the state. Well, anyhow, they put him into the gifted program. So then when he went to junior high, I found out that he wasn't in the class with the children that had been in the gifted program with him, and so I went to ask the principal why, and he wanted to act like there was something wrong with me, and I told him that, well, these are the requirements, and he met the requirements, so I have the choice of thinking you're either stupid or you're racist. Which one do you prefer? So they put him in the gifted program, and it was, theoretically, the schools in California, you think that they're great, but other states, us having moved around and what have you, other states, they have a warning flag if you bring a kid in there coming from California, literally speaking, because the schools were not as good. And by the time Gail was coming along and should have been in the gifted program, it turned out that they were getting the money for the program, but they didn't have the program there. They were just getting the money, so it was just a different world. But we survived, and like I said, all my children graduated from college, and all of them got advanced degrees.
Do you want to talk about Joy? Is Joy and what happened? Do you care to talk about that? Or?
Well, Joy, from the time she was born, she had eczema, and sometimes worse and sometimes better and what have you. But as a teenager and a young adult, it was just like still there. So she read about a program in Texas where they had some fairly famous people that they alleged had attended and dealt with eczema and what have you. So she made arrangements without telling me and what have you until the day we were taking it to the airport. She made arrangements to go to this facility to have this miraculous cure that they had. And so she went down there, and she ended up, one night I got a phone call, and then they essentially told me that she was dead. And much to my surprise, I was writing notes, and because it was a day and age when legal suits weren't as widespread and popular as they are now, but I knew then that I was going to be suing them, and I did. And I ended up going down there at least three different times, but it finally went to court and we won. And so that was quite the shock, but we went and we won, and they eventually went out of business. And one of the things that really, I was glad that I went and that I won and what have you, but there were actually senators from another state who had a kid that had died there like that, and it's like, if he'd done his job, I wouldn't have been in that position. But
What came of your other three children? I'm sorry.
They all went to college and they all got advanced degrees, and so did the grandchildren. So I'm just grateful and I admire them, and I hope that the great grands make it through.
Is there anything now? I just enough. You talked about you. What about you? And since raising your children, have you done anything? Have you traveled the world, or have you done anything since that time when your children are out the nest? Did you do anything yourself? What did you do when you finally had your own time?
I just lived.
Did you travel at all? Or?
Oh, I've done a tremendous amount of traveling, and I actually recently one of my nieces who travels often had written something on Facebook about somewhere she had been, and I told her that I wish that I had a map of the world so that I could show my grandkids where different places that I had been. And guess what? I got in the mail a few days ago a map of the world from another one of the nieces who had seen my comment, and she sent me a map of the world. So after we take care of all this today, the next big project will be figuring out how I'm going to show the great grands where I've been and where I've traveled, because I mean I've done it and I've enjoyed it.
Can you tell us where you've been?
Oh, I can tell you a few places where I've been. Please. But Alaska, of course, where my first child was born, but China, Hong Kong, Russia, Tokyo, Japan, lived in Europe, traveled Europe too, Australia, New Zealand, you name it, it's a lot of them, and I'm just really glad that I was able to go and to enjoy all of them.
Beautiful. With all you've seen, is there anything you want to say? And are you seeing it all? From your seeing your great grandmother who experienced slavery, seeing the first Black president, and everything that's been happening since with COVID and Floyd. What? Please give some brains of knowledge to those generations.
Well, I just feel like I've known 7 generations of my family, and I am glad to have been able to know them, and glad to have been able to live the life that I have, and certainly hope that you guys have the ability and the skills, because you certainly had them to inherit.